Okay, today we are going to cover 2 weeks worth of material, ideally, really a week and a half. Starting all the way back with where I believe Elizabeth left off, correct me if I'm wrong, at chapter 15. So, just to reorient us, because I love this map, it's really Tim Mackey's map recreated in my PowerPoint doc. But just to kind of give us a here's where we are in the map of Deuteronomy, we're right smack here in the middle. We're in what some would argue is the worst section. And I would say if that's how you feel, just hold on because we were previewing next week's reading and it's a doozy. So we are in the section on covenant laws. And I thought it would be helpful today to actually show you how these laws are broken out. So, this one section that goes from chapters 12 through 26 is really broken out into three distinct sections of laws. Think of this as three big buckets of laws. The first section we've been wading through over the past few weeks is laws about Israel's worship, laws concerning the temple. We'll round that out this week with chapter, I think we start at 15. So we'll round that out with chapter 15 and 16. And then once we get into chapter 16, the latter half, we really, you'll notice it immediately. We stop talking about Israel as a whole and start really talking about how Israel's leaders are to behave, how they're to organize themselves around different leaders, what the character traits of those leaders are called to do and be, which is a pretty important section. And there's an interesting pattern that even as I was preparing for tonight that I'm starting to pick up on that I want to point out in that section. And that's two chapters, 16 or three chapters, 16, 17, and 18, but it's only a small portion of 16. And then the last big swath of the law, which we will approach today, but really dig into over the next 2 weeks, the latter half of this week's and next week. And I even think if I remember correctly, we won't finish with it even at the end of next week's reading. So we're still in this for another 3 weeks. Is chapters 19 through 26, which really are the civil laws, laws concerning social justice. It's like the everyday people, how you're called to live. I would almost say the lines are not even, but it's love God, love your neighbor. And really that blends a lot together. And in the middle is how are Israel's leaders, called to help facilitate that? If I could give this one big swath paintbrush blow, that would be how I see it being organized. Before we start looking at these laws, I just want to recap. I think Elizabeth probably talked a little bit about this, but there are three principles we have to keep in mind as we approach these kinds of sections. No matter what law you're reading, whether it's civil, about a leader, or just about Israel in its entirety, these principles are key to your sanity and your trust in the Bible. Where you leave these rules, you're going to struggle immensely to understand why some of these things are in our Bible, particularly things that we're looking at next week. So, what are these three principles? These are the Bible Project's three principles. They're not unique to me, but I really love them. The first is these laws were not written to you. Like, God did not put Deuteronomy together with you in mind for you following these laws. They're not written to you. These are laws that were written to a very specific group of people who lived at a very specific time, in a very specific place, within a very specific culture. And until we learn to appreciate that for what it is, immerse ourselves in that culture, and approach the law then with curiosity rather than judgment, we're not going to understand what God is trying to communicate to his people through these laws. Second, if we want to take a step toward doing that, oh, well, by the way, let me finish this sentence. The laws are not written to you, they are written for you. We'll talk about this a lot today. I believe there is wisdom for us in the law as we unpack what they mean for the original people. Okay, step two. If we want to understand what God is saying to his people through these laws, it is not a helpful exercise to compare them to our modern laws. So, do we have any lawyers on the call? Only a few of you have your cameras on. Any lawyers? By the way, I'm going to do my thing where I mute you all, and I apologize in advance, but it's important if I can find the right button combination. Okay, you can always pop off mute if you need to. um, if you are a lawyer and you're going, well, that law could never stand in our modern world. Well, yeah, it's not meant for our modern world. The way that the law operated in the ancient world and the way that the law operates today, two completely different law systems, two very different things with very different purposes. Our law is very literal. If you break it, you're going to jail. Here's the crime, blah, blah, blah. The law in the Israelite thought is this is hard for us to even articulate. It's more of like guidelines, okay? It's meant to be wisdom, not hard and fast rules governing everyday life. Do you see? That's a huge distinction. We like measure things by the law. You know what I mean? It's like by the book, by the law. Ancient Israel, this was meant to guide them and steer them in the right direction. But the primary purpose of the laws in Deuteronomy are not to tell Israel exactly what to do in every possible circumstance. The laws in Deuteronomy don't cover that. They don't account for every single circumstance. The laws in the Torah don't do that. It's not to, in every single way or thing that could happen in your life, here's what to do. It's to show them the kind of people they're supposed to be so they can then make wise decisions on their own. So, if we want to see how progressive the law is, progressive, because for us, the law feels repressive. But if we want to really understand how progressive the law was for Israel, you don't compare it to our laws, compare it to their neighbors, Assyria and Babylon. The Code of Hammurabi is a great example of this. If you have time and you think this would be a fun exercise, go read the Code of Hammurabi and see what did they say about their slaves? What is it called what is their warfare like? And just compare that with what we find in Deuteronomy. And I think you'll be surprised. Third rule, look for the core principle beneath the law. And we'll do some of that tonight as we practice this. But you're wanting to ask yourself these two questions. How does it call Israel to show justice or wisdom? And how does it lead them into loving God and loving their neighbor? Now, these will not always be easy questions to answer when you see some of these laws, because to us, they're not going to look just, they're not going to look loving. But again, we have to first approach these laws with curiosity instead of judgment and put ourselves in the shoes of these ancient people. So before we dive in, any questions, thoughts, comments on any of this so far? Feeling all right? Thumbs up, thumbs down if you're nervous about this. Okay, great. And again, just as one final reminder, the law was not the means of Israel's salvation in the world. The law was not going to save them. God is the person who saves them. The law is meant to guide them in how they live so that they can show the nations how they love God and how they love each other, representing God well within the world. Okay, so with all of that in mind, let's actually go into the law itself, starting in chapter 15. So the law starts in chapter 12. Elizabeth walked through the last few sections of that when y'all met a couple weeks ago. We're going to start with chapter 15. Do y'all hear the baby monitor in the background, or is that just me? No? Okay, if it gets too loud, I may have to step away. We forgot to put that in the other room. Okay. The year of canceling debts. Now, who's a business person on the anybody with a business mindset, own a business, work closely with the bit? Nobody. What do y'all do for a living? Okay. I want you to imagine that you are a business owner and every 7 years, if you're like a bank, I want you to picture wiping your ledger clear. Anyone who's not paid an invoice, anyone who owes you something, you, after every 7 years, are called to just pretend like it never existed. Okay, what would be your reaction to that today? If that was like a new law instituted in America? I see thumbs down,
It
Stan.
wouldn't work.
It wouldn't work. Why? Why would
Well,
it work?
I guess it's just not our principle of business today.
Yeah.
Because
What do you
Well,
making
think?
it,
making
it,
money
it, it
is
would be an enabler for people to shirk their debts.
Ooh, okay. So there you go. That says something about what we value. We want to hold people responsible for their debt.
Well, yeah,
Okay. Do you see here how already our modern culture, our modern law is coming up against this ancient law and the ancient wisdom and practice? Okay, so remember those two questions you're supposed to be asking as we read through this. And then I'm going to ask you again at the end, what is the wisdom here for us today? So here's how it works. Every 7 years, all Israel is called to cancel the debt. Every creditor cancels the loans that they have, um, not requiring any payment. Again, there's no poor people among them. You're supposed to help them. By the way, oh, I hate that it keeps doing that. All the debts are supposed to be canceled. And by the way, if we jump down here, any bond servants that you have acquired are to be set free. So we're not even talking about just capital here. We're talking about people. When you see the words slaves in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, this is what it's talking about: bond servants, not slavery like what we know from our history in the West. This is slavery where I have come into a debt I can't repay. So I am going to sell myself to Sandy and work for her until that debt has been paid off. It's not a now, I don't want to say that, these bond servants were never mistreated, but that was not the primary crux of this. Was economic and temporary. You could work to earn your freedom, or after 7 years in Israel, you would be set free. Do you see the difference here? Very big distinction. And what was the purpose of this? Look at verse 4. There need I'm going to go back to using my web platform. There need be no poor people among you, for in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you. If only you obey the Lord your God and are careful to follow all these commands I'm giving you today. Okay, Stan, you talked about this would never work today, right? Why? Well, because we want what's owed us. We need I think it was you, Susan, who said we need the money. We're all about the money. We want to get what's owed us.
but we would be forgiven too.
Yeah, but look at what God is saying here is the crux of this. Who should we be depending on for us to be blessed?
Him.
Yeah?
Yeah.
God.
Is it
God.
should we be looking at our economic security as a sense of identity and security and provision? No. Do
No,
you see
God.
what this is doing? Can you imagine the trust and faith that it would take to cancel all debts owed you and set the people that you depend on to make your business run free? And that is the level of trust that God is calling his people to. And as part of that, not only is he calling them to trust him, he is calling them to take care of one another, to recognize that their fellow Israelite should mean more to them. That person's thriving and flourishing should be more important to them than their bottom line. Is that a message we need to hear today? Now, what again, I'm going to ask you, this is the way it worked in Israel. It's not going to work here like that. We're not a theocratic nation, but also we just are a different culture. But what is the wisdom there for us? What does it look like to mine this for wisdom that we can put today? What comes to your mind?
I think we're supposed to trust God because he's generous with us, so we must be generous with others.
Yeah. Should we be people who are concerned only and primarily about our bottom line? No. Our economic future, just like the Israelites, is primarily dependent upon who? It's a gift from God.
God.
What else? What comes to mind?
Also, not to profit by giving someone a hand up, to kind of help them out. I shouldn't profit from that. I should be caring for that person. And if I'm going to loan them money, then I might as well just consider it a gift. Just help
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's really good. I thought you were going to say we cannot profit off the mistreatment of others.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you see that here too? Whatever profit is to be made for you, it is not by taking advantage of your fellow man. Because what God calls this group of people to is a radical generosity toward their fellows in such a way that it is disadvantageous to them. You are going to put yourself out in order to care for your fellow human. That's a big swing. Any other thoughts?
Isn't that agape love though?
Yeah, exactly.
Sacrificing for others.
Any other thoughts?
And also just being content with God's blessings and not going out and wanting more and trying to just secure more while repressing others.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, do you see? Oh, did someone else say something?
I was going to say, this is Jimmy. I was going to say, I would push back a little on all the comments that this would never work today. I disagree with that. And it wouldn't work on every level. Can't go out and buy a new Cadillac and then expect that to be forgiven. But, I've stopped operating now, but for 45 years, if patients owed me money and they made any attempt to pay, any attempt, $15 a month, at Christmas, their bill was forgiven.
Wow.
And, I didn't see that I was doing fine. They were struggling. Everything worked out. God took care of me. God took care of them. Everybody's fine. So I think it does work, at least on a small business standpoint.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's incredibly amazing. Yeah, I do. I think about the conversation where I've experienced this is student loans. Just think about the conversation in our country right now around student loans and the literal slavery. And I can say this as someone who had $70,000 in student loans from my time in college. That kind of debt is like a ball and chain that will follow you your whole life. I'm still paying it off. That kind of debt is like slavery for a lot of people today, keeping them from buying a house. For a while, it kept us from having children, kept you from being able to do certain jobs that have a lower salary because you got to be able to pay the loan payment. I mean, just think about that. What would it do for an entire generation of Americans to have that debt forgiven? I mean, just think about it. I'm not saying that that's what we should do. I'm just saying these are the kinds of conversations that I think Deuteronomy is asking us to have.
But isn't that what God wants us to do, is invest in the future, like he's investing in the future of his peoples?
I think that's a case that could be made from what we're reading.
I mean, I think education enables them to better our country, better our communities, better our churches. Education and literacy are the foundation, bedrock of our democracy.
Yeah. When I look at this chapter, all the way even down to the firstborn animals, what I see God saying is there is nothing in your economic arsenal that should be set apart from God. All of it should come first under the banner of the kingdom of God. Don't profit off the backs of people. Care first for your neighbor instead of your bottom line, and trust God with everything that you've been given. And I don't know what that looks like for you. I don't know what it looks like for our country. I'm not an economist. See, I can't even say the word. Economist. I don't know what this looks like, but I think that Deuteronomy wants us to wrestle with this. I think Deuteronomy wants us to wrestle with this and how we spend our money, with what we do and how we acquire material possessions. And I think it's worth asking, if you own a business or if you have a lot of influence in a business, how is that business running? Is it profiting off of people's misfortune? I mean, these are just questions worth asking. How we feel about moving on to the next fun section. Oh, Phil, I see you raising your hand. You're muted though. You got to unmute yourself. You working on it? Nope, we still can't hear you.
Well, Alex, I have a question in the meantime.
Yeah.
We were talking about every 7 years. And I think in one of the videos, it was talking about hitting the reset button.
Yeah.
Kind of thinking about it like that. But then in this video, and it also said a super reset.
Yes.
It was the Jubilee.
Yes.
And that's 50 years. Can you explain that?
I want to say it's 7 times 7 years, but I'm not fresh on that right now.
Well, it was 7 times 7 years, which is 49. So it would be that
So
50 going
helps
in.
when you can do math. Yes. The Jubilee was a time even for the land to take a break and be set free. So you would even pause for a whole year on profiting off the land. Again, Elizabeth called it a super Sabbath, being able to give even the land a break. And again, that is both give the land a break. There's a practical side of that people who are big into agriculture understand. But also, what does it do for an entire year for you to not have your means of provision and economic stability? It forces you to depend on and trust God with what you're doing. Jimmy, did you have a question or comment?
Alex, similar to how the number 40 seems to have significance in the Bible and keep arising, is there some special significance to the 7 here?
Oh, gosh, yes. How much time do we have? There is a whole series of podcasts on the Bible Project that I'm going to try and distill to 2 seconds. What is the first time we see 7? It's the 7 days of creation. 7 is a very important number in the biblical story. It shows up everywhere. I mean, almost any place you throw a dart at the Bible, and the number 7 is going to be in there somewhere. And it is all a reminder of the Sabbath, as Elizabeth pointed out in the email. Because what does the Sabbath stand for? The Sabbath is ultimately, this is my soapbox, not about put your feet up, take a breath, a breather, God needed a break. The Sabbath is ultimately God resting, a period of transition from setting up the world to governing the world. And so when we Sabbath, what we are saying is we are entering into that same rest. We recognize that we're not the ones who set up the world, God is. And God is the one running the world, not us. And so, what does it look like for the land to take a year-long Sabbath break? God is the one who put us here in this land. God is the one who keeps us here in this land. Every good and perfect gift we have from the land is because of God. It is a hyper fixation for them and a stark physical, tangible reminder of who God is and who they are as a result. And if they for a second get lost in thinking that they're the ones earning a fortune or they're the ones profiting off the land, they're the ones whose hard work is, bringing about all the fruit of the land, the Sabbath just whoop, puts that all to bed. God is the one who's doing all of it. God is the one who's continuing to help them in everything that they're doing. Does that make sense? You should go watch that series of videos. It's awesome.
Thank you.
Say, Alex, just one thing, Stan.
Yeah.
It looks to me like this would be an enabler for people to do knowingly after year 6, knowing in year 7, they're forgiven, borrow money or take advantage of the system, knowing that they will not be held accountable using the system. That's what it looks to me like it could be.
Okay,
So
I want to read you a verse. You ready? Because
Yep.
God, Deuteronomy knew, Moses knew that we were going to have this same thought. Because if you own a business and you got stake on the line, absolutely that's a thought that's coming to mind. Here's what he says. Verse 9, be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The 7th year, the year for canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. So, right here, we see God saying, listen, your temptation is going to be in the 6th year not to lend people money and, not to hire any new servants, because in a year you're going to set them free or cancel those debts. So, this is the opposite angle of what you're saying, Stan, right? It's coming from the business owner, the lender, not necessarily the personal responsibility side. But just flip that around for a second. What God is saying is give anyway, be generous anyway, show that kind of care and love for your neighbors anyway. So if we flip it back to the other perspective of, do we think people will take advantage of this? What do we think God would say to that, given this position here? What do y'all think?
I think one thing we're focusing too much on, we're focusing too much on, who's getting the benefit of it. I mean, it's kind of like if you have a CD in the bank and, and it's like, and it comes up to 7th year and the people go like, oh, we're not going to pay the CD out. We're not going to pay, you got $10,000 in there and you're trying to make some money off of it. What if they cancel the whole CD? What if in the credit card world, for people who like to use their credit cards, they're going to shut down that industry because they're going to sit there and go like, there's no way we're going to loan money. Credit card companies make their money off people who run up balances.
Yeah.
And so if they do that, credit card companies are going to be astute and people are going to go, I'm not going to invest my money in that because I know I'm going to have to write off the balance, which is way more than the amount of interest that they're earning. So you'll go into businesses and you'll see the sharp reduction in debt, but then that means that business slows down. That means that people who buy cars, people who go out to like 7 years on their car debt, that won't be happening anymore. People will have to buy cheaper cars, so they can get within the payment period. So
Yeah.
we act too much like other people are going to, like somebody else is going to pay for it. And actually what's going to happen is we're going to pay for it too. It's
Okay,
not
well,
like,
keep in mind, here's the tension I see is already fitting into exact law, our buckets. Let's figure out how to put
Alex?
it in. That's not what we're doing here. Remember, what we're doing is what is the wisdom core principle under the law? And if you had to boil that down to one word, what is it? It's generosity. It's generosity. It's not being tight-handed with what you have. It's being ready to care for the people in your charge, even if it costs you something. That's the core principle. If we were going to take this into our modern economics, that's what we take. Not necessarily the 7 years, it's the core principle of what does it look like today to build a culture around generosity and care for our fellows even when it costs us something. Now,
well, see, I think that's a totally different argument than what they're making here. I mean, I'm
yeah,
thinking if you're talking about generosity, I'm thinking you're talking about tithing, giving money, giving time, things like that. And, and we do have things like that. It's called bankruptcy law, you
yeah,
know, which is also helps people out. But it just seems like this is different than generosity because I think, I mean, it's so loaded toward people taking advantage of it. I mean, if you knew how sophisticated the financial markets are about finding out like when stocks are going up and when they're going
yeah.
down, there
Again,
would be
we're not talking about taking this exact law and stuffing it into our financial system. And generosity, we're talking about generosity of that goes beyond what we talk about in church world. Generosity is tithing. I want to make this one point, and then I know I see a lot of hands, and this is very clearly a topic that we care about. It is 7:37, and we've made it one chapter in a week where we have like 4 to get through. So I want last comment or question. Jill, I see you've had your hand up for a bit, and then we got it. If we want to get anywhere close to our goal for tonight, we got to move on. Jill.
I think that God isn't asking the Israelites to worry about those things. He's asking for generosity, and then that the other part is not on us. It is him to take care of, and he's there for us or for the Israelites. That's not our, I'm not talking about what goes on today. I'm talking about how it was back then. I feel like God was asking or telling people that's what he wanted. He wanted generosity and trust, and trust him that he will take care of it no matter whether people keep up their end of the bargain or they don't. That isn't our place. That wasn't their place to call. That's the way I take it.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I would add one word to what you're saying, and that's freedom. Very clearly, what does God value? Personal freedom. And I don't mean personal freedom to do what you want to do. I mean, he wants people to be free. And so he is saying, you're going to have to like disadvantage yourself at the cost of putting people free. And at the end of that, I believe what he says is, by the way, remember this, here it is, verse 15. When you do this, just remember I did it for you, right? So I'm not asking you to do something that I haven't already done for you. So just that's where I want to leave that. Thank you, Jill, for saying that. I think you're spot on. Okay, here's the next, and we're going to paint this with a big, broad brush. So this is a point where I need y'all to ask questions if there's anything more in depth you want to go through. Deuteronomy through chapters 16, really it's just 16, is going to talk about 4 different festivals. All of these are festivals we've covered at some point over the last 2 years since the Gospel of John. Passover, I think we're really familiar with. This is remembering the Exodus story, right? Which is pretty relevant because their parents were the one who lived this story. Mixed into that at the same time as the unleavened bread, which was, we left so, in such a hurry that they didn't have time to put the yeast in the bread. This is a remembering of that. It's a remembering of the law that was given. We get the Festival of Weeks. This is about the harvest. In the email, I put this really great quote from N.T. Wright. This is about bringing the first of your harvest to God. This is where a lot of modern tithing concepts and justifications come from. Whole separate conversation, not trying to make a case for that here. And then we get the Festival of Tabernacles, which is the fun one. Elizabeth, we joke that she's the expert on this one. If you've never heard her teach on the Tabernacles, just email her. She's the best. This is the one that is called Sukkot, where they build and live temporarily in there it is. Hold on. Computer trouble. Do you remember these from John? They build these little temporary tents, right? And that's where they live for, I think, a week or so. And again, all of these festivals in their different ways are meant to be a reminder to Israel about something that God has done in their history, rescuing them from slavery, giving them the law, continuing to provide for them, all of these things. The promise that God will once again save them when they are in captivity to a foreign nation. And what I want to put before you tonight in the limited time we have is that, do you see how the very worship of God is baked into not just their weekly calendar through the Sabbath, but also their yearly calendar? They are basing their year around the story of their ancestors. in every different capacity in every part of their life. We do this very limitedly. What are some of the ways we do this today on a yearly calendar? We bake in the worship of God. Y'all are all on mute. I see you all mouthing the words.
Christmas,
and Easter.
Easter, Pentecost.
Yeah. Any others you can think of? Yeah, those are the big three. Israel had dozens of festivals. Every time you turn around, Israel had a different festival. God knows something about us that we don't always remember for ourselves, which is we need regular reminders if we are going to continue to be faithful and remember what God has done for us. And so we celebrate Christmas and we remember the birth of Jesus. And so we celebrate Easter. We remember the death of Jesus. And we are in those times, the seasons of Advent and Lent, called to relive different parts of our story, different parts of the biblical story, so that we can recenter ourselves in who we are and how we are so called to live. So I would just challenge you as we have Christmas approaching in a strikingly short amount of time. I was in a Christmas meeting today for the church where we were talking about very detailed things and how we're going to worship together on Christmas Eve. 2 of them, in fact. Don't let this season breeze by without you using the core principle underneath this, which is this season in our calendar is not just a random holiday picked, here to open presents, but a reminder of the story that we are a part of, the story of God that we fit into. How can those seasons renew your faithfulness and renew your sense of scale in the story of God? Does that make sense? Any questions on any of these in particular, or anything you want to go into more detail with for 16?
Yeah, it's Sandy. I think Matt called all this rhythm of remembrance.
Oh, I love that. He's so clever.
It's got a rhythm, as you click off
Yeah.
the calendar days and the events, and then you rinse and repeat. It's a rhythm of remembrance.
Right. Yeah, so that would be a great way of phrasing this for you is, what is your rhythm of remembrance? And for some of us, that will include different times. There may be things that are personal to you and to your story, right? The death of a loved one or a particularly difficult holiday for you. What is I would even challenge you, and I'm just coming up with this on the spot, like get a calendar and mark out your seasons or rhythms of remembrance. How does your calendar challenge you or prompt you to worship God? And Christmas and Easter ought to be on everybody's. But what are the other little moments through your year, right? Those are only 2 months. What does the summer look like for you? I think that would be a helpful exercise for all of us to do. Not homework, just a thought experiment. Okay, ready to move on? 15 minutes, we're going to rock and roll. Okay, now we are approaching the part of chapter 16 where it switched. We've been talking about worship for a long time. How do we worship God? What does the worship of God look like? Worship from the calendar standpoint, worship from what we are and are not supposed to worship, all kinds of different things associated with worship. Now, these next really chapter and a paragraph are about Israel's leaders. And here's the pattern I want to point out. So each section is going to talk about a specific leader. So in this case, judges, what their character traits are, ones that don't pervert justice or show partiality, they're not corrupt, all of that. And then after we hear about a specific leader, we are going to get a very specific, in this case, pretty lengthy paragraph section on what they're not supposed to do, the whole people. And in this way, so for example, Judges, message against idolatry, Asherah poles, sacred stones, these are idolatrous things associated with Canaanite worship. And then here are the consequences for that. we don't like it, stoning a person to death. It's pretty intense. Elizabeth talks about this in the email a lot. And we can go into more depth if you want to. Okay, so here we had judges, don't be idolatrous. The law courts, right? Anything that a judge can't deal with, here's what you do. It's the Levitical priests and the judge now who come alongside to do this. We get the king and all the king is supposed to do. And oh, by the way, here are the things, not there. Here are the things that the kings are not supposed to do. Do you see this pattern in play? What I think this is doing is like a tapestry weaving together Israel's leaders and who they're called to be. And they're called to a high standard of faithfulness and character, every single leader of Israel. And all the things that we've been talking about for chapters and like you probably got sick of hearing me talk about idolatry, worshiping other gods. Those things are going to be made very, very clear in these sections around Israel's leadership. Because what we see in the biblical story is so go the leaders, so go the people. So if the leaders become idolatrous, the whole nation becomes idolatrous. You don't have to go far to see how this works out, the Judges. There's a whole book called Judges. And the cycle of the Judges is God appoints a judge, they lead the people are corrupt, they don't listen to the judge, they have a foreign nation come in and overpower them, and then the people cry out, God rescues them, appoints another judge, and the cycle just repeats all over again. Did the judges work? No. And here we have foreshadowing. What does God say they're going to want? The king. The king. This is
different kind of king.
Yeah, First and Second Samuel in a nutshell, right here. And I want just pay attention to the language here. When you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you, that you're staring at from the top of Mount Nebo, when you've settled in it for a while, you're going to say, let us set a king over us like the nations around us. Before they've ever taken a step into the promised land, God knows this about them. And what he's going to say is, that's not what I would want for you. But if you do that, be sure it's one God chooses. Do you see mitigating the consequences of fallen people's choices? That's what this whole section is about. And here we go. So you're going to have a king, the ultimate ruler over Israel. But let's put that in perspective. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him. He is to read it all the days of his life. This is Psalm 1. Meditate on the law. His delight is in the law. Don't consider himself better than his fellow Israelites. So even when the people have a king, who is ultimately in charge?
God.
But it's God through the law. The king is not to consider himself above the law. The king is to consider himself the one who upholds the law. It is to be precious to him. He is not better than his peers. He is the mediator of his peers. That's what God's, if you're going to have a king, this is who your king is supposed to be. By the way, how does that work out for them? Not great. Not great at all.
Solomon broke everything.
I mean, just it goes south. Elizabeth points out in the email, everything that God tells him not to do, not a foreigner,
Solomon does.
every single thing Solomon does, like within a year or two.
Wives, chariots, everything.
Then we look at two different leaders. And I think that this is worth pointing out. So there's the priests who come from the tribe of Levi. By the way, these are not allowed to have any land of their own. Everything that they have, shown here by food offerings, everything they eat, their provision, their nourishment, comes from the generosity and the faithfulness of their peers. What does it mean? What is the wisdom behind creating a class of rulers in Israel that are dependent upon the generosity of their peers. I said this in the email. It's a whole different world going to the Vatican and looking at the incredible opulence of St. Peter's Basilica or even St. Paul's Basilica. That is not saying it's bad. It's just saying there is a time in church history, not just Catholic history, but the church history, where we've seen what happens when the church owns land and exists to prop itself up instead of in this model. Does that make sense? You know what I'm talking about here? Did it do the church any favors? No. Bad things happened as a result. You don't have to go back in too far in history to see what happens to the church when it becomes corrupt because it exists to prop itself up or to reap an inheritance or own a bunch of land. I mean, land still today is a measure of power. The more land you have, the more power and wealth you have. That's true today. It was uber true in the ancient world. And so what God is doing is creating a system of mediators, priests, who are not to play that power game, who they're motivated to inspire the people to faithfulness because that's how they live. It's a beautiful feedback loop. Does that make sense? And then again, right in the center of this, we get this whole section on occult practices. The priests are called to depend on God and God alone, the generosity of their people through the people's faithfulness to God. All of these things in chapter 18 that Moses lists in the occult practices section are things that Israel would be tempted to believe could give them guidance apart from God. Do you see the pattern at work? Your provision, your guidance comes from God and God alone. We see that with the kings and with the Levites. Reminder, don't turn anywhere else for that sense of provision and guidance. And then finally, we get the prophet. And this is just a beautiful section we've talked about a lot, where Moses knows that this isn't going to work. And so he says, by the way, there is going to come someone one day, a prophet like me, who will rise up from among you. Listen to that guy. He really knows what he's talking about. And wouldn't you know, this is how the end of the Old Testament comes about. The book of Malachi is the book before Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament. This is the last paragraph of the Old Testament. See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. The end of the Old Testament begins a season of 400 years of waiting for a prophet, in this case, like Elijah. But way before that even happens, we get the first taste of that. One day, there is going to be this greater prophet than Moses who's going to rise up and be able to lead the people in faithfulness. We talked about this a lot when we studied Matthew's gospel. This is why we're able, through the structure of Matthew, to create a map of Moses' story and the Israelites' story and how it is almost exactly a replica, or Jesus' story is exactly a replica of theirs. What's the message here? Matthew's gospel paints Jesus as this new and greater prophet, the new and greater Israelite, the one to whom we should be listening so that we can be led in faithfulness to the law and faithfulness to God. Is this making sense? So we are right all the way right here, left with this anticipation, not just of a prophet, but of the king who will come, the king who will be faithful, who will hold the law as precious and meditate on it, of the prophet who will be like a new Moses come to lead Israel in faithfulness. Are you seeing where the messianic threads started to develop for Israel? And better, we sit on the other side of the Messiah. Are you seeing the threads of Jesus being woven all the way back here in the Old Testament? Can you see the little well springs of hope Jesus as the King who does hold the law as precious, who leads us to faithfulness, the prophet to whom we listen to because he knows what's coming and who we are and has that new word from God. He is the Levitical priest, the new and greater priest. We'll read about that in Hebrews when we get there in February. All of these things Jesus comes to ultimately fulfill and set right. But we see the little seeds of hope and promise being planted right here in the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, it's 7:57. We're at chapter 19. Let's see how far we did. So this is behind the scenes look at our Bible reading plan planning. We're at 19. We made it to the first reading of this week. I I don't know if that's good, but we did it. I'm going to say we're going to pause here. And so next week when we gather, we will pick it up with chapter 19 because I want to stop and use these last few moments. Questions, thoughts, comments? How are we feeling about all of this? Do we see the principles at work? Not written to us, but for us. Look for the core. Don't try and compare to our modern laws. How do we see that playing out in these few chapters? Are we in?
You know, Alex, if I may,
Yeah,
yeah,
please.
yeah. I found another Tim Mackey Bible project, so I thought you might like hearing this. In his Year of the Torah series back in
Yes.
2014, I don't know, that might have been the time you were there, but as he's going through this, as you started as well, to this tonight, reminding us about why we're going through these laws. He brought us to back to Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 6. And he said, keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who, when they hear all the statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. And that really moved me when he said that, because, you know, there was a time in our history, and remember, I'm speaking on the other side of the world to you all with the election coming up.
Wow.
There was a time in our recent history where we really were looked as, I think, a great nation with wise and understanding people. So I think there's a lot in all of this that we're going through that can help us reorientate what we're thinking about. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, I love that. And even if we are not people whose level of authority and power can change the direction of a whole nation, I think it's worth asking, what do the principles underneath these laws change about our own families, our own businesses, what we do have authority and power over? I think it's worth wrestling with. I love that you brought that back. What else? Thoughts, questions, comments, massive concerns? Are we enjoying the law thus far?
So far.
I'm
I
actually
see
loving it. I
so
love it.
much enthusiasm.
Hey, Alex, I really love it. I just
Yeah.
love because it's just God telling people this is how you need to act. You are the people I'm sending out to quote unquote make disciples of all men, and this is how you're supposed to behave. I mean, we can learn a lot, but just understanding that you know God knows best. He really does, and we need to trust Him
Mhm.
and listen to His guidance. Um, I wish He'd write them out for us today.
Right. Don't you wish God would do an addendum, an
Yes,
update, a version 2 of the law for
yes.
us modern Americans, how we're called to live? Yeah, absolutely. Here's what I would love for you to take away from tonight, wrestling with. What does it look like for us to live with generosity, to love our neighbor, even if it costs us, even if it costs us economically to do so? And what does it look like to set up a world where our world is, our environments, where humans can flourish and thrive? and where our calendar is even built around the worship of God. This is the challenge I think that we have. Melissa, I am awful at looking at comments during these classes. I'm going to try and put back on the principles here. So there you go. They're here. If you want to screenshot them while they're up here, listening to looking at any other questions that came through.
Alex, if I may, also one more comment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on the comment of economics, I liked what you had to say regarding that, because anyone that wants to dive into that in detail, actually, the Nobel Prize was just awarded to 3 economists, right? And it was for studies of how institutions are being formed and affect prosperity. And if you dive into their work, it says that economic success isn't always about economics. It's about building and maintaining the civic bonds that allow people to prosper.
Oh, that's good.
How about that? That's
Yeah.
the Nobel Prize that was just awarded to 3 economists.
Lovely.
So there is hope. There's a lot of hope in this world for all of this. It's just sometimes when we read about stoning people to death, I think we get turned away.
Do we want to talk about the stoning? Or do we want to save that for
Well,
next
you
week?
said Elizabeth mentioned it, so yeah.
Well, I know we talk about it in the email. It's the stoning for idolatry back up here before the king and before the law. Yeah. This is if a man or woman living among you is found doing evil, aka worshiping other gods, setting up altars to other gods right beside altars. And I hope my computer's not about to die. If it does, we'll see you next week. Why is death the wise choice here? Do we remember 2 or 3 chapters ago where God was saying, hey, by the way, all these foreign nations, wipe them out entirely? I think a very similar thing is happening here. Very commonly in the Old Testament world, what you'll find is death penalties that were never actually carried out. And I view this as God wanting to establish the weight of the crime, even if that's not the maximum sentence actually given out in every case, which, by the way, is borne out in chapter 19 with cities of refuge. God is always going to provide a way out for the guilty person in most cases, in a lot of cases, I should say. But what we see is God wanting to establish with no mercy what happens to people who worship other gods. It is going to lead to death, whether years down the road when all the nation is put to death in exile, or the individuals themselves who are responsible. So I know that this is hard to kind of process through, but I think it's worth noting what we're talking about is the formation of this nation. And for God, right here, it's very important that that be done in such a way that does not promote idolatry. And by the way, he makes provisions against false testimonies here. It can't just be one person. I mean, this is really important that God is saying, you must purge evil from among you. And we just have to wrestle with. That's the weight of idolatry. And I wonder if that's hard for us, because I would argue idolatry is still today, just like it was thousands of years ago, the number one thing that we struggle with. I mean, just think about that. Idolatry is the number one thing our nation, us as individuals, struggle. Putting things before God, worshiping things that are not God, is the number one thing we are guilty of. And it is the number one commandment that God says, if you get this wrong, you are headed toward death. And I think that that's the core principle that we have to wrestle with underneath this passage that makes us bristle. Okay, we're going to pray because my computer's about to die. And I know that y'all all have things to do too. We will pick this up with Cities of Refuge. And if that was not a satisfactory answer for you for the death penalty, we're going to talk about it even more over the next 2 weeks. So if that doesn't get you excited to keep going, I don't know what will. But let's pray. God, we come before you now and confess that sometimes, as beautiful as your word is, it is difficult. And over the next few weeks, we just prepare for difficulties ahead. We prepare for things that make us cringe or that turn our stomachs or that make us question who you are and who you've called us to be. So, God, we ask for curiosity. We ask for your grace and love to cover us as we read. We ask for understanding, for illumination. And God, we ask that you would help guide us in understanding what is the wisdom in these laws that we are called to carry forward today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Fast
Thank
and
you.
Furious
Thanks,
night.
Alex.
This one
Thanks.
Thank you.
Glad
was.
you're back.
Yeah.
Great job, Alex.
Thanks.